Okay, I think we're now going to move to the next part of our event today. And I'm going to be in conversation with Ella Bertu. Ella, do you want to switch on your camera and unmute yourself? Hi, Ella. Do you want to perhaps say hello to everyone first? And maybe say a
Hello.
few words?
Yes, and thanks for that lovely talk, Shaf. I really enjoyed that summary of what it's like to be reading in the pandemic.
And just to explain to everyone, Ella is a bibliotherapist. She's a real life book doctor. So she will try and match up various people's emotional and psychological needs with books that she thinks will help them. And I'm going to ask her some questions and she's going to come up with some suggestions. I'm going to start with a question about sort of trying to make sense of what's happened, you know, the enormous changes that have occurred as a result of the pandemic. I know lots of people have read things like Camus' The Plague. I myself reread it over the summer. I took a couple of months before I went back to reread it, and I did, and I loved it. And other people have read things like Defoe's Journal of the Plague Year, or Pepys's Letters, or even Boccaccio's Decameron, all of which have the plague as, you know, parts of their plot. But, you know, what books would you suggest that would really help us make sense of the pandemic, of the lockdown, of the quarantine, of the kind of situation we find ourselves in?
Well, there's so many that I can suggest, but a couple of favourites that have been coming up recently that I've been giving to clients are Blindness by Jose Saramago, which is one of my favourite Portuguese novels, which is also set during a pandemic, and I'm sure you are very familiar with. And it's in an unnamed Latin American country where a plague of blindness is spreading through the population, and the authorities have to try to control it in rather awful and terrifying ways. And I think it's a great book to read at the moment because it takes our situation to a further extreme and makes it worse than it is now, but also shows you how love and loyalty actually win through. So it does give a lot of hope, even though it is quite a grim novel at times. And then the other one, which I think is a great read at the moment, is Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, which is quite a prescient book because it was written a few years ago about a flu pandemic. And in her novel, 90% of the world die. So it's pretty grim. And obviously, touch wood, a hell of a lot worse than what we're going through. But what makes it a great novel is that the survivors are a group of Shakespearean actors, and they are traveling around Canada acting to anyone that will sit and watch. And it, again, a bit like Blindness, it has a lot of optimism and hope and humor at its heart, which make it a really good read. And it doesn't dwell on pain and suffering. It's much more about starting again.
I think we're getting lots of positive comments about Station 11 in the chat box. I'm just picking up on one comment here about someone who was teaching Station 11 in Canada in March, which is rather wonderful. Ella, can I ask you a little bit about kind of issues around concentration? Because I know I've had this problem. I know lots of other people have had it as well. I mean, I've been struggling to concentrate in terms of reading sort of big books or long novels during this pandemic. You know, I find it quite hard to immerse myself in a big book, which is something I used to find really easy before. And I mean, it's basically because we're surrounded by distractions, right? You know, following the news, stuff on Twitter, all that kind of thing. So what would you suggest would be helpful? Any strategies to adopt? Any particular big book that you would recommend at the moment?
Well, I would actually start by suggesting not a book itself, but a modus operandi of reading. So I would say to anyone that can, create some sort of reading nook in your house. So a place to go to read. So you can see behind me is my lovely reading chair, which I'm very lucky to have, and it's my haven. And I know that kind of perfect reading chair, not everyone's going to have space for, or ability to get hold of, and I only got it quite recently and I love it. But one can create a reading nook anywhere in your abode, which can just be even a cushion, which becomes your symbolic reading nook. And you can take that to a particular place in your house and make it the place where you read. And I think there's something very helpful and positive about having a specific object or chair, which is your reading chair, because it signals to you and your brain and anyone else that might be in your house that you're now reading and that you've gone there to read. So create a place to read. Also, when you go to read, turn off your Wi-Fi either at source or turn it off at least on your phone. So try not to take your phone with you. And if you do take it with you, put it into airplane mode so that you don't feel the urge to be distracted. So I think that can actually make a huge difference in terms of concentration. And the other thing that helps is to say to yourself, I'm going to read for at least 20 minutes. So you go and sit in your special reading place, turn off your Wi-Fi and say, okay, at least 20 minutes, I'm not going to do anything else but read. Because I think all of us are too easily distracted by the news and by Twitter and Instagram, etc. And it really helps if you make that pact with yourself. So you were also asking about maybe sitting down with a good book that is absorbing. And one of the ones that I've been recommending to people and lots of people have been loving is The Overstory by Richard Powers, which is a fantastic book all about trees. And it is fiction. It's a collection of interwoven stories. As you can see, it's quite substantial and long. It's a commitment to read, but it's a very empowering book in a way that makes you feel like you can have an influence on the future of the environment. So I think it's a very positive book to embrace at this time. And it is one that's quite easy to get absorbed into because it has different strands of the story coming from different points of view, and each one is actually very absorbing, and then they slowly mingle together like the roots of the forest mingling together.
That's such helpful advice. I mean, I'm definitely going to take you up on the advice about the sort of digital detox. It's the equivalent of closing the door, isn't it, and having that space to yourself and not being disturbed. And I think so many of us find that really difficult at the moment, and that's such good advice, isn't it? Just to give yourself that, sort of 20 or 30 minutes when you're switched off from other things, and it's just you and the book, and feeling immersed in that experience.
Yes, absolutely. And actually another way of perhaps finding ways to read more and be more committed to reading is to commit with a friend or relative to read a book together. So to say, let's both read this book and talk about it in a month's time, because then having made that commitment, you're going to feel an obligation to that person to read it and talk about it with them. And it's also a great way to connect and have something to talk about at this time when there's actually not a huge amount to talk about other than the pandemic, because we're all stuck. So having your own mini book club is a really great way to make more reading happen in your life as well.
I think that sort of very neatly brings me to my next question, which is about reading groups. And people who used to, I know a lot of people who used to be members of face-to-face reading groups in the past, and some of them have been able to sort of successfully transition to online reading groups, and others have just sort of given up. And do you have any practical advice about, just general practical things, selecting books, organizing meetings, helping to set up an online reading group? What would you suggest? Because obviously if they've got a habit of shared reading with other people, which is really valuable to them, we want that to continue for as long as we're in this sort of situation of limbo, of quarantine. So what would you suggest? What's your sort of top tips in terms of online reading groups, setting them up and running them and making them work and so on?
Well, I think probably one of my top tips is to have your online reading group with people that you're close to and really that you know and love, because although it's great that lots of online book clubs are proliferating, and there are some fantastic ones which are now global and full of thousands of members, and they're very valuable to observe and be part of, you can't really engage on a deep level with those book clubs because they're so big. So if you can start a book club with your close family or a small group of friends, maybe 4 or 5, it's much easier than having it with a big group. So it could be lots of people during the pandemic have found new ways of connecting with their families and started having a Zoom once a week or something like that. And I would suggest adding into that family group a book club, and suggesting that you all share books and talk about them. And it doesn't have to be blood family. It could be other forms of family. It could be friendship families as well. But a great way to start a book club, if it is with people who haven't been in one before, is to suggest that you each choose a book from your childhood and start off recommending one. So if it is a family group, it might be that your uncle suggests his favorite family book from when he was 10, which no one else has ever heard of or read. And they might come from a country where you've never read that book. So that's going to add to the fun of it. And it means that you'll share the book and also have a chance to get to know each other in a different way. Because if you're getting to know your grandfather's favorite childhood book, you might never have talked about that before, and that will give you a whole new understanding of that family member. And then once you've done the childhood books, you could move on to teenage favorites. So you could say, you know, what was your favorite teenage book, Mum, that you read? And hopefully she'll recommend something which you may not have read. Even if you have read it already, she will love going back to it, rereading it and sharing it with you. And then once you've done the teenage books, you could do the book, your favorite book of your 20s. So I think that's a really nice way to get people started on a reading journey together. And it gives you a great way to bond also as a group and get to know each other's backgrounds, cultures, and childhood experiences of reading too.
That's a fantastic idea, and it's kind of wonderfully intergenerational as well, isn't it? Which I think is hugely important right now. You know, as we're not that far away from Christmas, and none of us really know what's going to happen. Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask a question which has come up in chat, if that's okay. It's quite similar to some of the questions I had in mind, but sort of several people have mentioned whether you have any graphic novels or any comics that you would recommend as reading to get away from the kind of current situation. That's kind of good escapist stuff. Are there any that you'd want to recommend or suggest?
That's interesting, because actually the graphic novels I've recently been reading have all been quite dark. So there's one called The Island by can't remember his second name. I've got it and I could grab it quickly, but it's a very big book which is about immigration, really, and it's quite a sad, dark book, but it is brilliant. And then there's one called Ghosts, which I'm just trying to remember who it's by, which is about the teenage experience, which is also a fantastic graphic novel. And that's actually a bit more of an upbeat one. But one that comes to mind, which is more positive and uplifting in a way, is Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, the graphic novel version, which I do think is a great book to read at this time for many reasons. It's a fantastic one. Oh, someone's just told me it's Armin Grader, the Island book. Thank you. It's come up in the chat box. So yeah, the Fahrenheit 451 graphic novel is a really beautiful version of the classic Ray Bradbury graphic novel. It's kind of an easy read, but it's also very much singing the praises of reading generally and talking about how important it is to take books into your life and into your heart. So that's the one I'd recommend. And then the question was kind of relating to light books to take you away from stress and the kind of darker side of life at the moment. And one of the ones that I do recommend to people a lot, it's not a graphic novel, but I'll bring it in now, is Cosmic Comics by Italo Calvino, which is a fabulous book, which is short stories all about beings at the beginning of the universe. So it's kind of talking about physical concepts to do with physics, chemistry, and biology, but told a bit like Just So stories by Rudyard Kipling. And they're just fantastic stories. They're incredibly imaginative. And they obviously came to mind when you were talking about graphic novels and comics because of the word Cosmic Comics, but they are light. And I'm sure lots of you are familiar with Italo Calvino, who's a very playful writer. And I find these are really great escapism from the current state of the world.
Brilliant. I've got one sort of final question, Ella, which is sort of, I guess, a sort of more personal question, which is around, you know, sort of books that have been sitting on your shelves that you intended to read but didn't get around to until this pandemic. I mean, has this given you a chance to rediscover a book that's been sitting on your shelf for ages that you finally got round to reading? And did you have one of those serendipitous moments? Because, you know, we can't really go to bookshops very much or libraries very much. We can order online, of course, but sometimes you have that fortuitous moment, don't you, when there's been something sitting there and it's waiting for the right time, and that right time is now. So did you have one of those experiences during the pandemic, or maybe more than one, that you can kind of share with us?
Yes, I've had a few actually, because it has been a great time to be looking back over my bookshelves. And one of the ones I found was the Tales of the Unexpected by Roald Dahl, which I was talking about with my children. And then I was really thrilled to rediscover the book because I thought I'd lost it. And I actually found what really delighted me was that I'd made comments when I was age 11, reading it for the first time, next to each of the stories, which all say things like excellent or really scary, or, you know, nothing very profound, but or not quite as good as The Skin or something like that. And it was a real delight to find that, because it did really take me back to my 11-year-old self. And I very much remember talking about those books with my mum and dad, and also watching the Just So stories on TV, which were absolutely terrifying. Yeah. And another one I'll just mention, because I think it's a great book to share as well, is The Woman and the Ape by Peter Berg, which is a strangely wonderful book written in the 90s. And it's all about a woman running away with an ape, but the ape learns to speak English and is highly intelligent. So it's a very strange book, but it's really interesting in terms of consciousness. I also love the cover, this kind of jungle-esque cover, which is great. But it is one of the books that I love the most in terms of thinking about disappearing into a city and being a human in a city in an animal-like fashion. So that was a great one to rediscover, just because I was randomly looking along my shelves.
Brilliant. And it's just one of the positive things that's come, is, you know, having to look back at your books and see what there is that you haven't read. There are lots of other questions in chat, but what I'm going to do is we're all going to be sending the details of your Facebook Live sessions and your online bibliotherapy sessions to all participants. So it may be the case that people will have questions to ask you directly, but please join me in thanking Ella. Ella, do stay with us for the moment. And I'm just going to be passing over to my colleague Maya Palmer. Thank you very much, Ella. We may have more questions for you in a bit.